Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm here with Dr. Viviana Wick Shackelford. She received her PhD in Evolutionary Developmental Psychology in 2011 from Florida Atlantic University. She is currently visiting assistant professor in Sociology and Criminal Justice at Oakland University and also the co-director of the Evolutionary Psychology Lab there. Her research over the years has been evolutionarily inspired and has had the broader goal of gaining a more comprehensive understanding of violence and conflict within families and romantic relationships. Her research interests and record cut across the psychological domains of forensics, development, social, personality, clinical, and criminology, and these are basically the topics we're going to cover today, focusing on romantic relationships, conflict between partners, parent-offspring conflict, and things like that. So, Dr. Wick Shackelford, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Okay, so I've already had your husband on the show, and it was a great conversation. So I guess that today we're going to focus a little bit on more or less the same topics, I guess, but expanding a little bit on them because you do a lot of work together, right? So let me just first ask you about this. Since we're going to talk about first conflict between partners, romantic partners that is, I guess that it is important for us to start a conversation by talking about parental investment, specifically in humans, because we're going to focus on humans. We could also include other species, of course, just for reference, but anyway, what would you say is the importance for us to understand parental investment theory as an evolutionary mechanism and the sort of implications that it has in order for us to have a better understanding of where the conflict in romantic relationships in humans stems from?
Okay, that's a loaded question. Parental investment theory is, I think it's the crux of, a lot of research in evolutionary psychology. One of the things that, sort of a side note for myself, is when I became involved in evolutionary psychology and learned about the field and some of these, important underlying theories, it actually impacted the way I thought about life in general. So, it's one of the, I think, benefits of an evolutionary psychological perspective. Once you're introduced to it, you can't leave it at the office anymore. It becomes a part of your life and thinking. And I would say that's very much true for parental investment theory. Because one of the most important parts of parental investment theory is understanding that, men and women have different motivations, different interests in how they, care for their offspring, how they invest in their offspring, and it begins before conception. So we have this long history of ancestors who kind of laid the groundwork for these evolved psychological mechanisms that we have today. So one of the, I guess, sort of to hone in on one of the most important parts of this is that, men and women have different, different motivations and different interests, and it starts with, their own reproductive biology. So men and women invest reproductively at the onset, differentially, right? So women invest way more, developing eggs and so forth, where, the investment by a male just producing sperm is, relatively a lot less. So it's from there, and that's sort of simplifying it, that we get this differential investment and interest in caring for children. And then, from there, of course, gestation goes on for 9 months or 40 weeks, and then it just doesn't end. And so, those are important in terms of, kind of developing, and those are problems that females and males are, exposed to differentially, and, react differently. Of course, this is not saying that one is more important than the other, or one is better than the other, but there are two different motivations when we talk about parental investment theory. And we see this in, the behavior and the psychology, throughout all species, for the most part.
Mm-hmm. Okay, just before I ask the next question, let me just say that at the beginning, when you were referencing the fact that when you first got in touch with evolutionary psychology, it really changed your worldview, right? Let's put it that way. I mean, I guess that happens to all people that get in touch with the discipline without addressing it from a moralistic standpoint, because I mean, it's very easy for people to come up with those fallacies against evolutionary psychology, like when people say that perhaps it promotes a traditional worldview in the sense that men should behave in a certain way and women in another, and perhaps women should go back to the kitchen or something like that. And I mean, it's really frustrating that people come up with those arguments that have already been countered several times over the last 30 years or so that evolutionary psychology has existed ever since Lida Cosmides and John Tooby published The Adapted Mind. They already in that book they countered those arguments, but they keep coming up again and again. But just another thing, I guess that people who get in touch with evolutionary psychology, it has that effect on them. And I told this to Dr. Karen Perilou off the record, but I'm going to say it here. I guess that it has the same effect on people as cocaine had on Freud, because because once we get in touch with it, I mean, it's impossible for us to go back and to look at things, and particularly human relationships, the same way, right?
Oh, absolutely. And yeah, I agree. And, with this fallacy, and it really is sad, because I think that, it's almost like they're just reading the headline and leaving, and, we all do that, but sometimes we walk away with the wrong information, or interpretation is not exactly what the reader intended for you to take home. And I think with this perspective, though, there's truly so much more that we can do with it. And rather than, thinking of it as a stifling, perspective, I think it actually opens up the world for possibilities, so it's kind of like understanding our history, right? Typically we like to learn from history and so forth. So that's the way I see it, So yes, we have this beautiful ancestral history, and I think it's, still today just as fascinating as it was when I first, learned about it. That, here we are today, a product of this wonderful process. Yes, because we have an ancestral history that designed our mechanisms, and we see our behavior today. It doesn't mean that we can't change it. It means that we can. The challenge is, how do we do it, right? It's not that we can't do it. It's too bad for them, that they just don't get it, because, and then I think it also, one of the things it does is I guess maybe you have to be open to, realistic interpretations of the world. And I think that the perspective allows for that. So, I can look at, I think nature differently. I look at my children differently, my relationships differently, and, find a lot more value in it, beyond the day to day. I know we're going off into like a different, this is not a therapy session. So anyway, I think it just allows for a deeper appreciation of, everything around us. And I think that's a good place to be. It's a good place to be for questions, for, curiosity. I think it's great for our kids, because, I ask them questions, or I point things out that, I think most kids don't. And a lot of kids who don't have parents that are evolutionary psychologists, they're not asked these questions, and appreciating. Like, one of my favorite things is watching vultures fly, right? Just the ease with which they fly, and just a minimal effort, it's just beautiful to watch the dynamics of their feathers, and, how they're interpreting the wind and so forth. And it's just effortless. I show my 7-year-old daughter this, I pointed out to her, look at the vulture, look at it, And so, there's an appreciation for, how did that come to be, and there's so much we don't know, so I just don't understand why, or how they come to this, this idea that it's trapping us and wanting us to go back to the way it was. I think it's enlightening. I think it's freeing, that we don't have everything under control. But we have enough under control because things are usually okay, right? We get through the day without killing each other. We eat, our body, our hearts pump, it's, so there's, I think there's a freeing, thing about it.
Mm-hmm. Yes, several interesting things there. Just before we go back to parental investment, because I mean, you reference the fact that perhaps there are many things that are not under our direct control, but I mean, that's also a good thing, because I guess that if we were to be able to control everything that happens in our bodies, including our brains and our minds, I mean, we would go mad, because the huge amount of information that we have to deal with and that we process unconsciously. I mean, if we were to have to do it consciously, I mean, it doesn't seem possible even to think about it, how we would do it. But the other point that I have, and I've already discussed this briefly with some philosophers, and the part where you said that perhaps it gives another sort of value to life and things and how we relate to other people, is the fact that until very recently, historically speaking, and even from a scientific perspective, people were speculating about what were things like emotions and how our minds worked and things like that. And I guess that evolutionary psychology and evolutionary biology also, and all things related to biology and evolutionary theory, also give us a new perspective in terms of okay, these things that we call emotions, for example, they really do exist. Perhaps they don't exist in the form that we intuitively think about them, but they are as real as atoms. And I guess that's good to know, because people could be speculating about these things and someone could simply come and counter their arguments by just saying, oh, you're just coming up with those things. Emotions don't really exist. It is all just illusions and things like that. But with this approach, we really get to know that these are at least evolved entities. Right.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, they're evolved, and I think they're necessary components to to motivate behavior. So jealousy is, a wonderful example. I mean, it's part of, that emotion of jealousy is necessary, for us to, it's a necessary part. So I'm trying to figure out the right words without saying it incorrectly here. It's a necessary component for, maybe not to produce a behavior, but to understand, why we, care when someone else is, looking at our partner, or, if our partner has an affair, right? It's sort of those emotions that, it's an emotion that, you're kind of protecting yourself, right? So, and just like, feelings of love, we say we love our children, but, if we peel back, the onion of love, right, it boils down to, our genes, right? But it's a necessary component. I think it's Lita Cosmides and John Tooby who talked about, emotions as, calibration mechanisms for our emotions, or for our behaviors. So depending on, to what intensity our emotion of jealousy or love is, right, then that sort of motive, it kind of dictates what kind of behaviors we should, will engage in. So I love that analogy, the calibration, that's sort of, why we have emotions, and they're used as calibrating, mechanisms for us in dictating our behavior.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's go back to parental investment then, because I guess that, in humans, I guess that it is crucially important for us to know how it works, because we particularly are a species where our infants really go through a very long and slow period of development, a really extended period of development in comparison with other animals, and even more specifically with other primates. And I guess that's really important for us to have parental investment on the part of fathers, because otherwise it would be really difficult for women alone to raise a child, right? I mean, we have cooperative breeding as well, but I guess that the role of fathers is not to be neglected, right?
Oh, absolutely. And there's a lot of research on, parental investment, and looking at, the differences in which men and women invest in children, and then also, the cross-cultural work on, mortality, child mortality, and looking at differences. Of course, it's best to have, mother, father, and surrounding family, have better outcomes. So it's not a matter of, is it necessary? No. Is it better? Probably, right? And it's definitely necessary to understand that in terms of, conflict as well, right? We have two different sets of interests that are operating here in parental investment, and and then of course we have conflict that arises. I'm sorry, I forgot what your question, where you went with that question. I'm sorry.
Well, I was basically asking about the role that fathers play in. Yeah. Okay.
So with fathers, right. One of the things that I'm thinking about right now is, the type of involvement that fathers engage in with children. And I think it's really interesting that fathers tend to engage in more play with children than mothers, while mothers, of course, spend more time overall with children. How the quality of the time and the activities are very different. I think that's really interesting. Fathers have. And it's not surprising, thinking back about, the time differential there in spending with children, that, fathers are less certain that their children are there. So, they're going to spend less time with their children. So it's not, that the husband is just a jerk and he'd rather be working. But there is this sort of, underlying explanation for it. Of course, that doesn't deter women. We want our men to also, to be involved. It doesn't. So that's kind of going back to what I was saying earlier with evolutionary psychology. While I know that Todd's his psychology is such that, he's not 100% certain, that doesn't give him a pass. Go pick up the kids. He's excellent though. So it's, so we have these expectations, and I think they're sort of built in. We don't have to talk about, that there's, genetic conflict going on here. We know that that's going on, and if we let things go and operate, right, they will work itself out for the most part.
Yeah, but basically, I guess that you referred to paternity uncertainty there at a certain point, and I guess that's really important for people to understand, because I mean, it's really impossible, at least it was throughout most of our evolutionary history. Only recently we developed technology for people to really be close to 100% sure that that's really the father of that particular child. But I mean, it was not really accessible to males during our evolutionary history, and I guess that's a problem there, because nowadays when, for example, males don't want to invest in their children, and we try to develop policies to force them to really invest some resources on that child to help her development and her going to school and acquiring the necessary competencies to thrive in our modern societies. I guess that the knowledge that we can acquire through evolutionary psychology can also be useful to inform those sorts of policies, right?
Oh, absolutely. Just knowing that, basing policy on parental investment in theory, or at least, referring to it, I think will help policymakers. And it's really, I could say that for, issues of, filicide too, or, child abuse and neglect and child murder. And even in, where we see it in genetic families as well. It's a gold mine of information, I think, in evolutionary psychology, that if we could use it for policy, I think that the outcomes, I think, will be a little more effective. But I think one of the problems with this, this is my opinion, one of the problems with using the evolutionary psychological perspective explicitly, it kind of, because there's those negative connotations of, genetic determinism and, well, you just, it's the patriarchy and, those kinds of things, if it's made explicit that, a lawmaker or a congressperson is using an evolutionary perspective, I don't think he's probably, his career is over.
Because he would get a lot of backlash from people,
yeah, he
right?
would get a lot of backlash, and it's sad because typically in other disciplines, and my guess is in medicine, for example, they want to understand the root of the virus. Where did it start? Where did it come from? What what environment did it develop another strain, and so forth. And so here we are having this perspective that highlights our, where we came from, and why we see the behaviors we do today, and we're not taking advantage of that. We're using other influences like religion or just individual political type motivations for progress when it really isn't progress.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I've talked with several people from evolutionary psychology and evolutionary biology, and different people think about how we can apply knowledge coming from these sciences in policy making in different ways. Because, I mean, I've talked with Dr. Randy Thornhill about rape, and he basically has a couple of suggestions of policy making and informing children and adolescents through the education system about how their minds work, basically. But on the other hand, I've had Dr. Martin Daly on the show, and I asked him in what ways he thought that if we were to teach children and adolescents, about, particularly young males, about how their minds work when they are exposed to certain types of environments, that if that could help prevent violent behavior on their side. And he told me that he was a bit skeptic about that, that he was basically an environmental determinist, in the sense that he thought that we should strive to create the environments that would evoke better behavior, that is, better strategies for people to adopt. I mean, in that case, instead of having lots of economic inequality, try to reduce it, and then that environment would evoke better behavior on the part of young males. So, do you think that perhaps, if not toward creating better policies, we could at least use this knowledge to try to change or tweak certain aspects of the environment to induce people, or in this case males, to invest more in their children, for example?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I guess I could see the argument for both, what Martin Daly and Randy Thornhill are proposing. And so one of the things that I have recently put into practice is, so let's start with, what are we expecting? Do we expect males all of a sudden to invest 100% of the time with their children? If we create the perfect environment, or an environment, that, we think is going to be more ideal, what is our expectation? Do we expect that males, young males who are, jumping with testosterone, do we expect these males to, be, love and peace and singing, So I think that's, for me, in my opinion, I think that's the place to start. What are our expectations, right? Because I think you can create an environment that might reduce it, overall, and perhaps that's the goal. But when, you create the, sort of perfect environment, that perfect environment sets things up for someone to, cheat the environment, right? So what happens when we invest all of this time in creating this perfect environment, and we have, individuals, because it will happen where we have individuals that will not, don't have the machinery, or just individual differences, they're not going to be affected by this environment. But, on the other hand, I do see the value in that. But then also letting, the target group know how the environment's going to change. Because I think, we operate in our minds and our little world, and we have our, general expectations that are sort of unconscious, in how the world operates, in our daily lives. I mean, just in our little daily lives. And, letting, let's just take like middle school kids or in high school kids, letting them know how their minds work, and then also letting them know how environment changes it and how we're going to change it. So kind of bringing them into it, because and I think that would be true for, policies that have to do with, step parents, and also in cases of rape as well. So, it's sort of, having the target group, involved, and letting them know how things will change. And, perhaps that might be it. I mean, I honestly, I don't know what the answer, I wish I did. But I think it's worth a try, right? Because how much damage could it be? I guess it would cost a little more money, if we wanted to, change. And that's the other thing that makes it very difficult to, speculate about these things, because change is money. And But yeah, I mean, I can see either way, both of those, being effective in changing things. Well, we know just leaving it the way it is probably not a good idea. Maybe looking at different areas, within like the United States, for example, where we might see less incidents of aggression, less, child abuse and neglect, look at those environments to see how those environments, how they differ from an environment where, we see higher numbers. And it could be just as simple as the, income inequality. That might be, I think that's a huge issue. I think that would solve a lot of problems, reduce a lot of, aggression, violence. But that reducing that is going to cost money, as well. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, these are hugely complicated issues. So, and since we're talking about social problems, let's say, perhaps we could also make reference to domestic violence here, because we're also including romantic relationships in the conversation. So I guess that it would be very important for people to understand, even though it might be counterintuitive, particularly for modern westernized people, let's put it that way, to think about this, that sometimes or perhaps even many times when people perform some sort of a domestic violence act or something like that, they don't do it exactly because they hate their partners, but it's because they're trying to resort to some mate guarding or mate retention tactics, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's almost, and again, I know we're talking in general within that group of, where we see that kind of behavior. Yeah, the usually the motivation is wanting to control the person. But a lot of times those cases where, husbands or partners abuse their partners, engage in violence, a lot of times those women actually report having had extramarital affairs or engaging in, so of course I'm not condoning, abuse or anything like that. And, we're not, this is what they report.
It's just that if that happens, perhaps it's a bit easier at least to understand where the reaction of the male comes from.
Oh, absolutely. And of course, yeah, it's not saying, who's right or wrong and all of that, but it's just that, these behaviors, understanding, why and where it came from, his mechanisms are operating just fine, right? He's lost control, basically, and this is his way of getting control of the situation. Of course, it's wrong to do that, but this is where the behavior comes from. So, perhaps in, one aspect of this, scenario here is how do we deal with an individual, a male individual like this, who is responding to a partner who actually did commit, an infidelity. Right, as opposed to someone who, women who do not have extramarital affairs, and they're a victim of chronic abuse as well. So treatment of those male psychologies might be different, but yeah, and so so understanding those differences, I think will. I think it'll lend some ideas for how to, manage those situations. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's now talk perhaps about a very contentious topic, and I mean, whenever there's some sort of news about a case of this happening, and people go to TV and they have commentators there, saying that they don't understand why, for example, a parent would kill their children, because I mean, at least for us as modern people, because we invest so much in our children, it is really hard to understand why would someone kill their child, and because of the sorts of relationships we establish with them nowadays, where we really value children by themselves, let's say, instead of for example, as it happens in some traditional societies where people try to extract some economic value from children and perhaps they look at them in a different way, let's say. But I mean, it's important for people to understand that the interests of parents and their children are not always perfectly aligned, and sometimes people can get to extreme, and it is rare even that they get to that extreme where they kill their children, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. That's something that, is really important, that it's a rare phenomenon. We mostly engage in subtle negative behaviors towards our children. We don't run around killing our children or abusing them, fatally, or, neglecting them to a fatal extent. But yeah, it's in those cases where filicide, or when a parent kills a child, or extreme abuse and neglect, it's very common predictors. And within so in the area of child homicide, there's a neonaticide where a newborn is killed, and we know in those situations it's typically a very young mother who is often teenage or very young, who doesn't have paternal investment, or may not know who the father is, nor does she have family support. Right? It's almost. I mean, I would be lying if I gave you a number, but it's most of the time it's that that sort of scenario that we see neonaticide, and then there's other predictors as well when when a mother kills a child, and I think you talked about this with Todd a little bit, but genetic parents, if you just look at the raw frequencies, they kill a lot more, and that's the question: why would a mother or a father, because the numbers are actually very similar for mothers and fathers, and you would think that it'd be fathers that would kill more, but they're very similar if you look at just like raw frequencies, and why that would be the case. And I think it does present a problem, for explaining, why this would be the case, because it is counterintuitive when you think about it from an evolutionary perspective. So one of the aspects of, when a parent kills a child, that I tend to think about is, it's a very extreme situation, and in order for a parent to kill a child, I think there has to be a particular mindset that is necessary in order for that to happen, and because when we step back, we don't see it very often. That kind of speaks to how resilient parental psychology is, and the level that, needs to be, that is, necessary in order to do that. The other thing I can talk about is we have, the differences in genetic and step parents, and how they kill the children, and we know that the rates are a lot higher for step parents. And I think one of the more interesting things there is the way in which they kill the children, right? And so it's not interesting just for interesting's sake, but it's interesting because it tells something about parental psychology and differences between step parents and genetic parents. And it's we've replicated this result where the rates are higher, and not only are the rates higher for step parents, but the way they kill their children is different. So step parents are more likely to use methods like beating their children to death, or using a blunt object, and the explanation or the idea behind that is that there's this underlying, bitterness, rage, when a step parent kills their child. And why that is, the explanation that we've used, theoretically speaking, is, this inclusive fitness theory, where we have, there's this offset of, genetic conflict, right, where stepchildren don't share any genes with their step parents, and so there's this bitterness. I'm investing in offspring that aren't mine, and there's the conflict. He has, sexual access to the female, but he's got, this vehicle that he has to invest in. So there comes, this bitterness and resentment, and that sort of, and I mean, it fits nicely theoretically with, with the data. But again, I think what we see more often is like differential, like monetary investment. Like step parents will invest less money in their stepchildren. They will, they report being, they don't love their children, their stepchildren, the way that a parent, a genetic parent, loves their children. So we see, that a lot more often. It's just that when we look at filicide and abuse and neglect, it's very, I think it's very clear. But then you have, people that will argue against that there's other factors. And of course, there are other predictors of, low SES, or they might use more proximate explanations, well, he was drunk, or, drugs, or, things like that. But that doesn't really get at, it can't explain, this huge difference in rate that we see.
Yeah, I mean, there are no simple solutions to complex problems, and I mean, whenever people are exposed to a situation where even the genetic or the biological parents abuse a particular child, I mean, many times they just say, oh, take the child away from them and give it to step parents or to adoptive parents or something like that, and they talk about it as if it was a panacea or something like that. But I mean, it's really hard to evaluate or to decide what would be the best course of action there, because I mean, apart from the fact that these cases are really rare, and so perhaps in those situations people should think about additional ways to help the genetic parents that are doing those sorts of things, because they might have some sort of mental issue sometimes, or they might be poor or don't have enough resources and things like that. Because, I mean, when people try to really fast forward into a solution, a quick solution to a complex problem, if they take the child away from their biological parents and put them under under any kind of step parenting program or something like that, I mean, they might be putting that child under some even more problematic, even under some more problematic issues or something like that. I don't know, because they might put her in a situation where she is even more abused than she was when she lived with her parents, her biological parents, I mean.
Yeah, I think one of the things, at least in Western, society, where we have, we're not as tight-knit with our families as we used to be, and I think that also plays a role. So yeah, and thinking about, placing a child with a foster family, or, it's an alternative solution might be something like, providing support for that mother, something that sort of mimics having family, or, other, maybe more women around this woman, to kind of provide, emotional, social support that might help. And rather than, moving the child out with a foster family, yeah, I agree that it might be putting that child out for more, risk than it would be, if she remained with the mother, especially the mother. But yeah, I think this is one of the issues that, again, it's sort of a pet issue of mine. Not having the social support, women in particular, not having the social support that I think is not necessary, but I think it's an essential part of, child rearing. And I think, a lot of mothers today, are so stressed out, or have, a lot of, depression, anxiety, but I think a lot of it can be attributed to this spread of, families and females not having the, the social support in the way that, ancestral women had. But at the same time, I think women also, compensate. So they use daycare. They, have really, a close group of, female friends that sort of, parasitize those mechanisms. But I'd still say it's not, not having genetic relatives. I think, it's really two different things that are going on there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, we also have the issue, at least sometimes, of evolutionary mismatch, because we really live in a world that, even though it has a lot of good things that we didn't really have during most of our history, let's say, on the other hand, we are also exposed to a lot of things that are really difficult for our evolved minds to compute, and people have to learn a lot of things that are really counterintuitive in order for them to prepare for a job or for some sort of academic position or any other thing, and even to live in a modern society, of course, and to operate and to interact with other people in this context. And I mean, it is really difficult for people to understand, because we live in such affluent societies that perhaps on the margins of society there are people that live in very difficult conditions, and it might be very hard for them to have enough resources to invest in a child as we have to invest nowadays. Right.
Oh, yeah. And I think one of the issues that you raised there with, especially with technology, I just think as a mother, as a female, just, being bombarded with the news, for example, of rapists and, kids being abducted. We have our phones that go on alert, Amber Alert, someone, some child has been taken. That is, yes, what do we do with that information? That puts it into that overload. We don't need that information.
The availability heuristic gets turned on, right?
Yeah,
when we are exposed to those kinds of things all the time.
Yeah, it becomes like, oh my God, and most of the time, and I know this, of course, is anecdotal, I don't even pay attention to it. And I know that people will turn off the alert because it really is, it's just not necessary.
It's overwhelming.
It's overwhelming on top of, everything else that we have access to. And, we're not, and it's sort of built in. We are aware that there are strange males who have, ulterior motives in their behavior, and it's not necessary to be bombarded with it. But going back to those scenarios where we do have that income disparity and they don't have resources at hand, I think that in some ways going back to those basics, providing, female support, like family, pseudo family environments, that might be more female based for those women might be, a way to go, so that they don't resort to abuse and neglect and, in rare cases, killing their child. It takes a village. I think there's a lot of truth in that. Providing that sort of support might be, may not be, an expensive way to do it. The other thing that we talked about a little bit was, I want to go back to talking about kids and letting them know. One of the another pet interest of mine is, the adolescent support. For adolescents, I think a lot of times, they don't have the support that I think they need at this time, because one of the issues is technology, right? So we as parents, as adults, we're hit with this information, but we were older, right, when we were exposed to this, these wonderful things, and but younger minds who are not developed, they're growing up and, developing in this overload era as well, but they're also developing their normal, brain development, but they're constantly hit with this overload. So
you're referring to things like social media?
Social media and just access. Yeah, so they can just, and so the disengaging from, I think, the ancestrally typical environment, I think to an extreme. It's sort of an extreme context for them. And they're sort of just left there, we give them these rules, but they don't have the the social support, I think, that would be, helpful to adolescents. So a friend of mine, she works with adolescents, and, she's an MD in adolescent health and development, and she's just astonished at, again, at the community level, even, state and federal level, the lack of research in adolescence, the, lack of support, emotional support. We know that, with suicide and depression and anxiety, they're just astronomical. And that's something that I think, in terms of an evolutionary perspective, I don't have that much time. I wish I had more time in a day, but I think that would be, an area that we could use, some insight, and going back to the basics of, adolescent ancestral history, and, what do we do? How do we help, these adolescents during this time? So just a plug for my adolescents out there.
No, I mean, but I think you're right. I've been talking with a lot of people recently, and also about things like cyberbullying,
yes,
and bullying in schools. And I mean, social media, I mean, on the one hand, perhaps it's true that, as Jonathan Haidt and others say, that we've been overprotecting our children, at least to some extent. And I've already had, for example, Dr. David Lancy on the show, and he talks about how play works in traditional societies and how we don't give enough time for our children to play and to develop their social skills in modern societies. And I guess that's crucial. But on the other end, I mean, people sometimes talk about millennials and Gen Z types as being snowflakes or something like that. But I mean, are they really? Because being exposed to social media, it's really hard for people to deal with it, because they are basically 24/7 being exposed to the judgments of other people. And I mean, we used to live in societies up to 150 people. If we are to take Dunbar's numbers seriously, I guess that we should. And I mean, on the internet, we are exposed to virtually millions of people, and any one of them can attack us at any time. And I mean, even if we are highly intelligent and we know these sorts of things and how our psychology operates, we're still under the influence of those things, and it's sort of instinctive. I mean, we can't really brush that aside. We are really deeply affected by it. Right?
Oh, I wholeheartedly agree with that. And as I mentioned, I think as an adult, we might be a little more comfortable in our minds, right? We have a little more wisdom, I think, than, just maybe a little bit more than adolescents. And, I think that they're more vulnerable because they are, they're investing energy in, developing a healthy, normal mind, yet they're hit with this information that's not normal, and one of the topics that, that comes to mind in terms of vulnerabilities, thinking about body image disorder, for example. We know that men and women, boys and girls, also both develop anorexia, eating disorders, and things like that.
But it affects primarily girls, right? Body issues and body image
issues, right? So I think the basis for the eating disorder might differ, right? But the numbers are not that different. What we hear about mostly are females, because the underlying issue is body, I lost body image, concerns, right? I can't remember who the person was that talked about this, but basically, anorexia is sort of this intra-sexual competition gone crazy. That it's gone so far that you're willing to, basically kill yourself to distort your body. And that's a different area, but the issue is, so let's just go with females, female adolescents. I mean, it's enough that you have the physical presence of females, and at differing levels of puberty and adolescence, influencing the way you think about yourself. But oh my God, now you've got social media where everyone's got a filter on, or, they can enhance, different parts of their body, their face. And so you've got those females to compete with as well. So, the intrasexual competition it's exponential because we have the social media, and of course, that's not saying that every single female, adolescent female or adult female, succumbs to that. But I think it increases, the likelihood, and we see the number of females. I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but I do know that the numbers are increasing in terms of girls who are reporting eating disorders or body image issues. I think males don't get enough attention in terms of their, body image issues or eating disorders.
So do you think that the numbers are skewed toward female because people have not been paying enough attention to those same issues on the side of males?
Yeah, I do. I don't, again, I'm, speaking just, anecdotally, but I do know that, there's a higher percentage of males. And I think, if you ask someone on the street, do you think males have eating disorders? Oh, no, they don't. But, they do. But yeah, so I think that's something, again, coming back to, the evolutionary perspective and thinking about eating disorders, body image disorders, and things like that I think would be, beneficial. And at this time, because there isn't much help available or support for these adolescents, this would be a good time, for policies that are based on, evolutionary perspective, or, support systems that are based or taking that into consideration and developing, support systems. I think this would be a good time to do it before, they come up with something else that really isn't going to make a difference.
Yeah, and I mean, sometimes people come up with extreme reactions to things like, for example, until recently we had this model of having supermodels that suffered from anorexia, and now people are reacting extremely by saying that perhaps we should allow for more chubby models, but basically women that suffer from the opposite. That is, they are really extremely fat. They are obese, sometimes morbidly obese, and they want for people to consider those types of bodies normal. And I mean, I'm not here advocating for bullying or any sort of thing like that. But that's awful. But I mean, we have to deal with things as they are, and both anorexia and obesity are diseases, right?
Oh, absolutely, both of them. And I think, and I get the idea of sort of exposing both, extremes maybe, or, but I think that the issue is the focus on, it's the physical appearance that's everything, so whether you're, obese or whether you're very thin, we're still focusing on the body, right? And it's, so I guess to some extent, I get that normalizing just every type of woman, but we're still normalizing, okay, well, it matters how you look, depends on what you like, so I don't know how far that will actually go.
Okay, so perhaps just let's go back very quickly to the issue of filicide and infanticide and neonaticide, because there are another thing that we haven't talked about yet here, that is the cases of filicide suicide, because that is a very particular thing that is separate from the others, right? The situations where both the parent kills him or herself and also kills the child.
Right. Yeah, I haven't thought about that in a while. So filicide suicide, that is even more rare, right? My recollection of that literature is that there are some predictors, right, or characteristics that we see, that we can differentiate between those families where filicide suicide occurs, and that are sort of parallel to when we see a filicide, right? So we see males committing this more often. It's in the context of like similar to familicide, right? So predictors, there are differences in I think the number of children that are killed. We see males typically do this more so than females. But again, it's a very, I think it's even, it is even more rare than, filicide.
Mm-hmm. But do you know of perhaps what people say, or of course we're talking about suicide, but perhaps sometimes people leave notes behind. I mean, the ways by which they try to justify what they did by killing both themselves and their children, that perhaps they say that they were in such a dire situation that they think that it would be the best solution to their problems or something like that.
Yeah, in the case of, for some reason I'm blocked out with filicide suicide, but in the case of familicide, and oftentimes, there is the suicide of the parent, typically it's when a male loses his job, so there's sort of, and the I don't know about notes, but the sort of, message there, or the rationale is that, yes, that it's this dire situation, and I failed you, and it's better that we all die than for you to go on living in this horrible world. But it's usually I think it's time and time again it's a financial issue that becomes that is the primary predictor of that situation.
Mm-hmm. Well, okay, so perhaps it's better to end the interview here, because otherwise we would get into other topics that perhaps we don't have enough time today to explore. So, Dr. Wick Shackelford, just before we go, what would be some of the best places on the internet if people want to get in touch with your work?
Well, I actually, if you have an extra minute, I actually just started a new Facebook page and a new website called Darwinian Diva. And, the idea here is it's going to be a platform for talking about women's issues. So, if I would, check that out. It's new and ever evolving. So I would encourage you to check that out and support that. Otherwise, you can go to the Oakland website. A lot of my research and publications I do with my spouse and colleague Todd Shackelford, so you can see some of the papers there. And I think that's it.
Okay, so I will be leaving links to all of that in the description box of the video. And then again, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show. It was really a pleasure to everyone.
Okay, thank you so much, Ricardo.
Hello everybody, thank you so much for coming to my channel and for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've started this channel on February 2018 and have been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. So to keep the channel sustainable, I would really like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. Any amount, even $1, would already be a great help. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. You also have the alternative of supporting me on Subscribestar or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons: Karen Litzke, Anne Blanchett, Peruga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Chantel Gelina, Jim Frank, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Brian Rivera, Lucas Stafiniak, Sergio Condreanu, Jan Haninen, and my two producers, Isar Webbe and Rosie. Thank you for all.